do. Hey, welcome to Let 'Em Talk. I'm Paul D'Rienzo. We got a great show in store. I have an author of a book called Heavy Radicals, J Leonard, author of Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists. And I don't know, you might not know what a Maoist is, but we're going to explain to you what a Maoist is. There's a guy named Mao Tse-tung years ago. You might have heard of him. You might have seen his picture as it was painted by as a piece of art that was by who was the artist? Like, why am I going blank?
Andy Warhol.
Andy Warhol, right, of course, who did that wonderful Mao Tse-tung painting, which most people know Mao from that painting more than any other reason in the United States.
I think
but
he
there was
put lipstick on.
Yeah, we put lipstick on. Oh my God! So we're going to talk about America's Maoists, and you know, I've had members of the Revolutionary Communist Party, including Carl Dix, on this show. And then when this book came out and I read it, I was fascinated by it and the history about it. I hope nobody's upset or thinks that I'm here to really just let them talk. We're going to just talk about it and talk about the history of it, and I think it's fascinating, absolutely. So, J Leonard, welcome.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah.
I guess the thing about this book is a discrete time frame between 1968 and 1980, which is far ago is history for a lot of young people, but for you and me, it's when we were coming up, when we were young, and the most radical thing that seemed to be out there was something called the New Communist Movement in various iterations. I mean, they weren't the only thing. By 71, 72, the Weathermen and the Black Panther were in decline or in disarray or, in jail or, trying to reassemble. Maoism, which Mao Tse-tung was still alive in China, was ascendant. The biggest group to come out of that period was the Revolutionary Union, which started in the Bay Area in 1968. And by 1976, the FBI issued a kind of an overall memo primer to its agents and said that the Revolutionary Communist Party, which came after the RU,
yes,
they said that it was a threat to the internal security of the United States of the first magnitude.
I hope so. It's about time. All right, we need something like that soon, and before it's the end,
Yeah, well, with that kind of language, it's a tip-off that the FBI is giving a lot of attention to it. I mean, everybody knows that Hoover famously said similar things about the Black Panthers, and the Black Panthers had to deal with an awful lot of repression from the FBI as a result. But I think one of the things, I argue along with Connor Gallagher, who's a younger, he's actually living in China teaching, but he did a lot of the kind of path-breaking research on the book. But one of the things we kind of got from this is you can't really understand this era unless you look at the Maoist and particularly this group. I mean, whether you like them or not, that's something to put aside in debate. But these guys were, these guys and women were there, and they, by 76, they had organizational control of Vietnam Veterans Against the War, which was a very prestigious anti-war group.
John Kerry was a member of it himself.
Yes, he
John was a spokesperson for it. Right?
And in the early 70s, they were becoming very radical, and the people who weren't radical were leaving. They helped form the Attica Brigade, which was filling the void left by the collapse of Students for Democratic Society. Attica Brigade later became the Revolutionary Student Brigade, and they had chapters in most every university in the country. And importantly, they helped found the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association, which in the early 70s, people wanted to go to China. They had heard amazing things were happening. Now, we can look back now and see to what degree that was true or not. Again, it's a debatable point, but in the early 70s, people like Joshua Horn were writing about amazing things going on in medicine. Women seemed to be much more empowered in China, so people were very interested. If you wanted to visit China, you had to be part of this group, and the RURCP was instrumental in getting it formed, and they were at the heart of it. By 1978, U.S.-China had just under 10,000 members. Now, the RURCP was never as big as the Communist Party USA, which had, 100,000 people at its peak. I don't know how many actual hardcore cadre. The RURCP, by contrast, we
it's hard to believe there was actually a communist party in the United States that in recent times, not talking about the 1930s when there was the traditional communist party, but there was an organization in the United States as late as the 1970s and early 1980s that had a following like that.
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, you and I were in high school, and the bread and butter of high school social studies was anti-communism.
Yeah.
So, and this was after something like 20 years of Cold War. And I know personally, I was in high school, I became radicalized. I had a little red book, Mao Tse-tung's quotations.
Let's talk a little bit. Let's put people in the presence of the time. All right, the late 1960, 1968, 69, 1970. What was going on for folks who, and a lot of our viewers might not have even been born then. Some of them I know were. But for those who weren't around back then, who might not know about it, what was going on in the world in the late 60s and early 70s that would turn up the soil so that something like this could actually take root in the United States?
Well, people had protested the war. People had protested for civil rights. Black people were in open rebellion in most of the major cities in the U.S. There was a sense that people were pushing against the limits of the society they were in, and they hit the limits. Among the Students for Democratic Society, which was the largest radical student organization at the time, which did have about 100,000 members, at its core, it was going from radicalism to revolution, from protest to resistance. And so 68, 69, I think the most active people, or at least among the most active people, were saying we need a total revolutionary transformation. It's not enough to attempt to reform this. You raise that question, then it's like, so how do you do this? What's the way? What path do we follow? China seemed to offer a model. I mean, there was this Cultural Revolution going on, which said it's right to rebel against reactionaries. So there was a real attraction among this. I mean, one of the things we discovered in this book is the Revolutionary Union went into SDS and talked literally to the national leadership of SDS, who became the Weathermen. And they brought them, their analysis of Mao and Mao Tse-tung in their famous document, Red Papers, and the Weathermen said, the national office said, you guys should just print that. This is great. It didn't work out.
SDS was Students for a Democratic Society, which is a national student organization at the time with many thousands of members on thousands of campuses, and which was a real political force at the time.
Exactly. Very wide open.
Could students who owe $50,000, $60,000 in debts be able to organize anything like that today?
That's a pointed question.
Back then, college was pretty cheap.
Yeah, well, back then, if you were in college, you were probably very conscious, especially if you were a young man, about getting called up and being sent to Vietnam. I mean, it's literally, it's like your life, your whole future is like open to question. Just having that sword of Damocles over
right, and so you could be forced to go fight in Vietnam, which was Iraq on steroids, 10 times bigger than the war in Iraq, a real chance to get injured and killed. And so if you were 18 or 17, 18, 19 years old, and I felt that way a little bit, depending on what that draft number was, your life could really be in turmoil. And if you didn't want to go, it was 5 years in federal prison, so that was your choice.
Yeah, and it does
or leave the country.
Transforms your thinking. People became radicalized. They formed groups. They formed more and more radical groups, and the FBI paid attention. I mean, the Revolutionary Union was formed in early 1968. We actually asked for a lot of freedom of information documents. I was trying to find out, how was this group formed, because I couldn't get anyone who had been there at the formation. They'd either passed away or they didn't really want to talk about it. To talk about it, we got this file from Stephen Hamilton, who was actually very prominent in the anti-draft movement. He was one of the Oakland Seven in 1967 during Stop the Draft Week, which was a famous episode of resistance against the draft. Steve Hamilton was one of the founders of the Revolutionary Union. He passed away, sadly, in 2009. We got his file. And apparently, if you were on the FBI's tracking list, anytime a file referenced you, anything pertaining to you went into that file. And what was in his file that we got just before the book published were these single-spaced 12, 10-page reports from an informant who had joined the Revolutionaries Regional Executive Committee by its third meeting. The group was like 20 people, and the FBI is there. And a lot of people that's interesting. How
And is that something that we should, activists in Black Lives Matter? We just did a big protest for the homeless. I mean, is this something we have to think about? That like literally 5 minutes after a bunch of people, friends who know each other, get together, we're sort of infiltrated by somebody who's telling, which is what several books are saying right now, is happening right now. As we speak.
It's a fair question. I don't think my book has answers. I don't have answers. I do think there's real value in understanding how this stuff actually works. I know, having been around the left myself, everybody has their own theories about how it works, and some of them are right and some of them are not right. How it actually works is of some value. The FBI, as a doctrine, it seems like they had three kind of things they like to do. They like to infiltrate as things are starting, because that's the time to get in. They like to target people who they perceive as leaders. And the big thing they like to do is set people against each other, which is, you and I sit here talking. I think if we talk for 3 or 4 minutes just casually, we're going to start to disagree, which is fine. But here you got the FBI saying, I see a window here.
Right, so they see that disagreement, all of a sudden there's a falsified document sent to somebody claiming this about somebody else. So to me that would say, and whenever I see something like that, and I've lived through this, is to call up the person and find out right away what's going on.
Yeah, people need...
You should do that, right?
Yeah.
You should communicate. You shouldn't believe everything you read and hear about somebody. You should talk to them directly to their face. And I find on the left, and maybe this is a lesson we can learn because I was involved in fighting at BAI and Pacifica Radio and places like that. Boy, a lot of angst could have been avoided if somebody just got on the horn and asked if that was a true statement or not and what you meant by it.
I think that...
And they would have said, oh, okay, I thought it was something else.
It's a fair point, but the book does really show time and again, high and low, that this is an element. I mean, one of the things in the book that's complicated, but it seems like it's really important, is about 73, 74, 3 groups were trying to merge to form a new communist party. The Revolutionary Union, which was by design mostly white students, they had actually said, well, we're going to let people organize in their own communities, in their own...
Right, and I remember at the time, that's what they would say. Now, is that a thing that, is that something we carry on now, that, like, African Americans should have their group, white students should have their group, Latinos should have their group, like in the 60s, like you're describing now. You had the Young Lords, you had the Black Panthers, you had the Revolutionary Union, each one was for a different group.
Well, yeah, I
seems
don't
like
know.
anti-today how we think.
I don't know how I would answer it. I would say that is what happened. I mean, the RU, some people joined the Black Panthers, and it's our sense that they would have joined the RU, but the RU was actually encouraging people to join the Black Panthers, who were on the cutting edge of things at that point, and they thought they could influence them in that way. At least that's my sense. But so you have these 3 groups that were going to merge: the Black Workers Congress, the Revolutionary Union, and the Young Lords Organization, which had renamed itself the Puerto Rican Revolutionary Workers Organization, and it didn't work, and we think that the FBI might have been poking around to help that happen.
Right, I want to talk more about that, but first I want to say that we're talking with Aaron Leonard, who is the author of Heavy Radicals, the FBI's Secret War on America's Maoists. How can people find out more about this book? Where can they get it? Where is it?
HeavyRadicals.com. That'll take you right to it.
HeavyRadicals.com is the place to go, so that's pretty equal. Heavy Radicals, what does that term mean, Heavy Radicals? Because we were talking about folks who aren't just your run-of-the-mill radicals, right? They want a revolution, and so that's going to engender a response that's at a higher level. And
well, there was an article written by a syndicated columnist in 1975, and it was titled, it had different titles in different publications, but one of the titles was Heavy Radicals, terrorists said to be less important to the cause, and it outlined how it said there were 2,500 new communists in the U.S., and they were organized in groups like the Revolutionary Union and the October League, which was the next biggest group, and it was actually considerably smaller than the RU. But their view were these heavy radicals were big on theory, organizing, and had a strategic vision. And interestingly, the FBI, they corroborated that view. For example, we discovered by looking at the RU that when SDS fell apart, there was this internecine struggle. It was probably would have fell apart anyways, but the FBI was in there pulling for a resolution in its favor. One of the things they did, they instructed their informants to vote with the national office, who became the Weathermen, against what had been the Progressive Labor Party faction, which was a more organized, kind of an old line, leftist, quasi-Maoist. I mean, they were about
They
to
worked in
reject
union
Mao.
zone,
Yeah.
the we call it the Woikerism.
But the point is, the FBI said, look, these national office people, they're going to go off, they're going to get violent, they're going to get isolated. And better them than PL. It's the same thing. There's a split in the Revolutionary Union around 1970, in the late 1970, where one faction wants to go off and start a kind of protracted urban guerrilla warfare, kind of mixed in with political organizing and stuff. And the group split over this. There was intense debate in the United States and the radical left at that time about, do you do revolutionary violence now, or do you do more strategic work?
Right.
Again, the FBI said, one of their main informants, Larry Goff, said, well, I think Franklin is going to fade because they're either going to get killed or be in jail. I mean, this is serious
They're
stuff.
going to fade if they go out there and try to make urban guerrilla warfare in the United States without the basis supported on the community or any realistic attempt to.
But he also said that the RU was more dangerous as a result of being more strategic.
So that's interesting. So the FBI informant and the FBI and the police are saying that the more dangerous group is the one that rejects terrorism because they have more of a chance of becoming part of, getting believed and listened to by society.
Yeah, which is, that's just what it is. That's not a judgment on groups like the Weathermen or Franklin. They morally, these folks had deep conviction, and it's hard to argue, given what was going on in Vietnam, that they had a deep conviction about stopping
You had to be
it.
there. People don't understand it maybe, but there was like a war with thousands of people being killed every day, every week. It wasn't like a handful of dead people like they put on the television today in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was like hundreds of people killed every week. Just Americans, thousands of Vietnamese. So we didn't know that till later.
Yeah, and the U.S. soldiers who were doing it were, doing war crimes, and some of them came to their senses on that and really rejected it.
Right. Okay, so this is so we could go on for hours. Let's move the story. First of all, I want to say I'm wearing a button that I got from those days I found in my files, and it's take history into our hands. May Day 1980, right? And the whole idea, as I remember it, was the 80s were going to be. Yeah, here you go. Great. The 80s were going to be greater than the 60s. Unfortunately, Ronald Reagan got elected, and it didn't work out that way. We got Reagan, then Bush.
Yeah, well, it's puzzling past this. It was clear to me that Mao Tse-tung died. He had an intermediary leader, Wang Guofeng, and then Deng Xiaoping came to power. The net result is China came into the U.S. Sphere of influence, and they were kind of more on the U.S.'s side against the Soviet Union. It changed the international dynamic. In Vietnam, you had
Nixon went to China.
Yeah, you had 3 poles in Vietnam that transformed as Mao was dying. So by the 80s, the U.S. didn't have to worry about China and the Soviet Union.
Now here's another book I found in my files from those days. I inherited a number of these books. Here is And Mao Makes Five, which is referring to the Gang of Four, Chang Ching, Mao's wife, and saying that basically they were trying to uphold Mao Tse-tung's ideals, and that Deng Xiaoping and the people who brought China in the direction that it's gone since then. And today they're talking about devaluing the Chinese yuan, and they're making all the cell phones we have in our pockets, and they're totally phony communists. It's a lie. Every Chinese person from China I talk to laughs when I say you're communist, and they say I'm a phony communist. Everybody in China is a phony communist. How could things have changed so much, and how could the people have been so wrong?
Geez, I certainly can't answer that.
Yeah.
But I can say that this.
How do we react to it?
In my view, this was the Waterloo for the RCP. They grew, even though they had a lot of back and forth and internal struggles. But when Mao died in '76, they spent a year debating whether or not to support the new leadership. They couldn't come to a consensus. They split. This is a group that's probably between 12 and 1,500 people, and they lose a third of their people. And they go 2 different ways. They had people in factories all over the country, and auto plants, and meat packing plants, and steel mills. Some of the people who left mainly stayed in those jobs. The people who stayed with the name of the RCP, basically quickly started abandoning the factories and developed a whole new doctrine about how to build revolution. And it was kind of in sync with the turmoil in the world. Things were, they didn't have China to kind of hang their hat on, to look to as a model. And China did reverse. And there's been a lot of good scholarship since then about all of what has happened in China. It's another discussion.
Right. So, but what was interesting, how it played out here was there was a split in the RCP. There were two groups. One group believed that they should stick with China, and the other group saw the Gang of Four and Mao Tse-tung as being his ideals being dragged in the mud. And then some people say, heck, the Cultural Revolution was a disaster, that it was terrible what they did and disrupted the country, and it wasn't the right thing to do. Well,
I read this book recently by, it was about, Richard J. Evans wrote a book about counterfactuals in history. It's very popular to say, well, what if, this had happened? What if Hitler hadn't come to power?
Right.
And I think his whole argument is, well, history actually did develop a certain way for a certain reason. And it's clear now that China developed a certain way for a certain reason. And, there's no turning back. I mean, Mao did do this Cultural Revolution. It seems in the 70s he was attempting to kind of hold the country together by bringing in some of the very people who had been, criticized. I mean, you've got the fourth largest country in the world. And, you need
very industrious people who, despite their poverty and lack of resources, were in more than able to become great capitalist competitors, and wanted to be, and are competing. They're competing the hell out of us, and so maybe we have to go through that, before you can get to socialism. You sort of have to go through capitalism.
Well, I don't know what you have to do. I do know that the people who were in the party up to late 77, myself included, I worked very close with the party from the mid-70s on. It seemed like all the answers were there. And then suddenly, China starts going down a different road, and all the answers aren't there.
What do we learn from that? What did the RCP learn from that? What do we learn from that? I don't know what the RCP learned from that. What do we learn from that?
I think you need to study the world. You need critical thinking. You need evidence-based analysis. There's a lot of people out there with a lot of good ideas. Personally, I haven't found anybody who has all of them in one place.
Well, it seems to me that you're caught between, because you don't want to seem like you're flip-flopping around with whatever seems to be what's happening at the moment, but at the same time you can't just follow the lemmings off a cliff and not realize things are changing.
Well, I'm a historian, and I think the truth matters. So in writing this book, we tried to step outside of our own personal experience and examine this in a disinterested way, as they say academically, and we're continuing to do some work on repression in the FBI, particularly these kind of movements. But the truth matters. We don't have a nice, tidy set of answers for people, but we think there's stuff in here, particularly for people who want a far better world.
This is so. What is this photograph of? This is a fascinating photograph, and this is a good explanation, maybe. What at this moment, 1980, this is late 70s. What happened in this photograph? And if maybe we can zoom in on the photograph a little bit on the cover of the book, and allow people to see that, because what's happening is the police here are attacking these demonstrators on the side, and there's a picture of Chairman Mao right there, if you don't know what he looks like. And there's obviously, a riot happening here. I'm not sure. It looks more like a police riot than a protest riot, but pretty much all these folks here were arrested and given very heavy charges.
Yeah, well, Deng Xiaoping had come to the United States in January 79. The remaining members of the RCP, which had split, had resolved to go and confront him and create, essentially an international incident. They got down to the White House, and the Washington Post says when they got in front of the White House, they let loose a flurry of missiles, bottles, and various things at the police. The party's press says that the police attacked unprovoked, just because they didn't like the message. And that's actually the picture you see. It led to 78 people being arrested. Initially, misdemeanor charges. Within 24 hours, they were set to be felony assault on a police officer. So suddenly a huge section of the RCP, including its leader, Bavavakian, were facing very intense charges. So they were in a much different situation than they had been up to that point, where they hadn't, I mean, even though they were openly advocating armed revolution at the right moment, a mass armed revolution, they were not directly, engaged in violence or, promoting such a thing. But here, it seems the government felt, well, they crossed the line.
They crossed the line because they were messing with foreign policy, and they're directly messing with foreign policy. They were sticking their nose really where it shouldn't be, as far as the government.
It's interesting. I mean, if things get thrown at the police, it kind of changes the dynamic.
Tompkins Square Park. I was there, but the police attacked first, believe me, before the bottles. The bottles were defensive. I don't know if that was...
The police were brutal. They sent people to the hospital, and anybody who was on the other side of a baton that day came...
Yeah, you have to realize, sometimes I saw people go to the bottles because they're like, their backs are against the wall. They really have no choice, and in that way, there was revolutionary violence, so it was pretty much defensive.
This was a turning point for the group. Avakian, eventually, they dropped the charges of most of the 78. They winnowed it down to about 17. Avakian, who was then kind of the preeminent leader of the RCP. Before then, it had been more of a collective leadership, but Avakian was hit with serious charges. They were dropped, they were reinstated.
So the charges are what brought him to the forefront, and you saw his face everywhere all across America,
The party resolved to make a big presence of him at that point, and he then went into self-imposed exile in Europe. Right. Which is basically the end of the what's said.
And that's where your book sort of ends. We don't take the RCP exists today and does very good work, Black Lives Matter and things like that. I really appreciate the work that they do. I hope to continue to have them as guests on the show, and they've done a great job. And so we'll leave it. The history from you're a historian. This is the history of Maoism in America, and we have half a minute, but about the police. And let's get back to the FBI and how they mess with this. And in a half a minute, how can you summarize that?
That they're much more sophisticated than I think people give them credit for, which is not to say they can't be, extremely blunderous and awkward. But Hoover and his FBI, knew Marxism-Leninism, and they had some sense about how to get into this organization and create problems for it. At the end of the day, they did not determine whether or not this group failed or didn't.
Okay, so in other words, they harass and hassle and cause problems, but if the movement is there, it can overcome that.
The world determines more what you can do than the secret police.
All right, thank you very much. So secret police, get the message. We're not going away. Heavy radicals, the FBI's secret war on America's Maoists. Thank you very much, Aaron J. Leonard, for joining us here on Let Them Talk.
Thanks for having me.
Sure thing, anytime.